The velvet hush of the Silenus room shattered when a man's voice, thick with whiskey and entitlement, sliced through the low murmur of conversation. Clara felt a familiar dread coil in her stomach as her ex-boyfriend, Mark, stumbled towards her station. His face was a mask of furious possession. Before she could react, his fingers clamped around her wrist, a cold, bruising grip that anchored her to a past she desperately wanted to escape. The clinking of glasses paused. The quiet negotiations in shadowy booths ceased. Dozens of pairs of eyes, cold and assessing, turned to fix on her, pinning her in a spotlight of public humiliation. She was no longer an invisible hostess. She was the centerpiece of a vulgar, unwanted spectacle, her quiet dignity unraveling thread by thread under their collective gaze. But the shadow she ran to held a darkness far deeper than she could imagine, and if you stay with us until the end, you will discover why. Subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Clara, at 22, lived a life of stark contrasts. By day, she was a student at the conservatory. Her world defined by the disciplined grace of a cello, the scent of rosin and old wood, and the quiet pursuit of beauty. By night, she wore a simple black dress and a practiced neutral expression, navigating the opulent labyrinth of the Silenus room. She was a ghost in this world of wealth and power, her presence meant to be felt but not seen. Her silence was a shield, a carefully constructed wall to protect the fragile dreams she nurtured in the daylight. She moved with a quiet resilience, her posture straight, her gaze downcast, a woman holding onto her moral compass in a place where such things were merely commodities to be bought and sold. The oppression was not overt, but a constant, suffocating pressure. It was in the dismissive wave of a patron's hand, the leering gaze of her manager that lingered too long, and the relentless weight of her student loans. This job was a gilded cage, the high tips a necessary poison that kept her tethered to a world she despised. Her small apartment, filled with sheet music and secondhand furniture, was her only sanctuary. There, she could breathe, away from the cloying scent of expensive cologne and the low hum of dangerous conversations. She felt a profound solitude, a sense of being an outsider in her own life, fighting a silent battle for a future that felt increasingly distant and unattainable with each passing shift in this opulent prison. The atmosphere of the club was a sensory assault on her principles. Low amber light gleamed off crystal decanters and the polished surfaces of mahogany tables. But it never quite reached the faces of the men who sat in the booths, leaving their intentions cloaked in shadow. A lone jazz piano played softly in the corner, its melancholic notes a deceptive soundtrack to the ruthless transactions unfolding around her. The air, thick with the scent of aged scotch and quiet ambition, felt heavy in her lungs. To survive, Clara focused on the details, the precise angle to pour wine, the soft click of a door closing, the rhythm of her own breathing. It was a form of meditation, a way to disconnect from the moral decay that felt like a tangible stain on the air she breathed. This fierce need for integrity was born from loss. She carried the memory of her father, a man who taught music in a public school and believed that art was the purest form of truth. He had passed away 2 years prior, leaving her with not much more than his old cello and an unwavering sense of right and wrong. Each night, as she served men who could buy and sell entire city blocks, she felt the sting of that legacy. She was upholding a promise made to him, a silent vow to never let the world's cynicism extinguish the small, steady light of her own values. This conviction made her vulnerable, an anomaly in a world built on compromise, but it was also the source of her unyielding, quiet strength. Mark's voice, a venomous hiss near her ear, pulled her violently back to the present. "You think you're too good for me now, Clara? Hiding in this place with these animals?" His grip tightened, his knuckles white. The humiliation was a physical heat rising in her cheeks. She could feel the stares of the patrons, a mixture of mild amusement and cold indifference. They were watching a show, and she was the unwilling performer. Panic began to cloud her vision, the carefully constructed walls of her composure crumbling. She scanned the room, her heart hammering against her ribs, searching for an exit, a distraction, any escape from the closing circle of her shame. There was nowhere to run. She was trapped in the center of the cage. Her desperate, searching gaze swept past the curious faces and landed on a figure in the farthest, darkest corner of the room. He sat alone, a silhouette against the dim light, a still point in the swirling chaos of her panic. He wasn't watching the scene with the casual interest of the others. He was simply observing, his presence a void of absolute calm and control. A glass of dark liquor sat untouched before him. In a room full of noise, his silence was the loudest thing she had ever heard. It was in that moment, with her world collapsing, that her instincts took over, propelling her toward the one shadow that seemed to hold more power than all the glaring lights combined. The late-night bus ride home was a purgatory of flickering fluorescent lights and the sour smell of damp wool. Clara leaned her forehead against the cool, vibrating glass, watching the opulent storefronts of Manhattan blur into the grittier, shadowed streets of her own neighborhood. The velvet and crystal of the Silenus room felt a universe away. Here, she was just another tired face in the crowd, her simple black coat, a stark contrast to the designer clothes she had just spent hours navigating around. Each jolt of the bus was a reminder of the chasm between her life and the lives she served. She clutched the strap of her cello case, its familiar weight a grounding presence, the only part of her true self she carried between her two disparate worlds. Her apartment was a small, fourth-floor walk-up that always seemed to hold the chill of the evening. It was less a home than a holding cell between shifts and classes. Sheet music was neatly stacked on a worn armchair, a silent testament to a life she fought to keep alive. The only real decoration was a framed photo of her father, his kind eyes, a source of both comfort and a quiet, aching pressure to endure. She would often stand in the center of the room, the city's muted symphony filtering through the thin walls, and feel the weight of it all: the rent, the tuition, the cost of instrument maintenance. The silence here was different from the clubs. It was a hollow, lonely sound, filled with the ghosts of unpaid bills and deferred dreams. Days at the conservatory were her only moments of real oxygen. The air in the practice rooms was warm and smelled of wood polish and focused effort. Here, she was not an anonymous hostess, but a musician, a creator. The deep, resonant voice of her cello was her own, a sound that could articulate all the sorrow and hope she kept locked inside. Yet, even this sanctuary was tinged with anxiety. Her professor, a stern but brilliant man, pushed her relentlessly, his praise always followed by a reminder of the dedication required, the sacrifices necessary. She saw the effortless confidence of her peers, students whose families could afford their passion without question, and the familiar feeling of being an outsider would creep back in. The weekly phone call with her mother was a delicate dance of omission. Clara would speak of her progress at the conservatory, her voice bright and steady, while carefully sidestepping the exhaustion she felt. Her mother, practical and worn down by a life of her own struggles, would listen with a sigh. "Music is beautiful, honey, but it doesn't pay the bills," she'd say, her words not unkind but heavy, with a pragmatism that felt like a betrayal of Clara's father's memory. Clara never mentioned the leering patrons or the ache in her feet. She bore the burden of her choices alone, protecting her mother from a reality she knew would only cause her more worry, deepening her own profound sense of isolation. Mr. Henderson, the manager of the Silenus room, moved through the club with the predatory grace of a shark. He never raised his voice, but his disapproval was a palpable force. He would watch her from across the room, his eyes cataloging her every move, a small, knowing smile on his lips that made her skin crawl. His corrections were always delivered in a low murmur, close to her ear, his breath smelling of mints and stale coffee. A hostess is part of the ambiance, Clara. Present, but invisible. Remember your place. Each phrase was a carefully polished stone, dropped into the calm pool of her composure, creating ripples of fear and resentment that she had to constantly fight to suppress. He was a gatekeeper, and the price of passage was her dignity. The uniform was her armor. Each night the ritual of dressing was a deliberate act of transformation. She would smooth down the simple, severe lines of the black dress, a garment designed to be elegant yet forgettable. It erased her curves, her individuality, her very essence. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, emotionless knot at the nape of her neck. Gazing at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror of the staff locker room, she saw a stranger, a composed, hollowed-out version of herself. This woman could withstand the dismissive glances and the condescending tones. She could smile blankly and pour wine with a steady hand, because she was not Clara. She was a function, a ghost in the machine of opulence. Time in the Silenus room moved differently. The grand, ornate clock on the mantelpiece seemed to mock her, its gilded hands crawling from one hour to the next with agonizing slowness. Each tick was a beat in a rhythm of relentless servitude. She measured her shifts not in hours, but in the number of condescending questions answered, The number of coats checked. The number of times she had to bite her tongue to keep her job. The low, melancholic jazz from the corner piano was the soundtrack to this suspended reality. A beautiful, sorrowful melody that underscored the feeling of her own life being put on hold, wasting away in the service of men who would forget her face the moment they walked out the door. From her station near the entrance, she was an unwilling observer of a world built on unspoken rules and quiet dominance. She saw men who commanded entire industries with a single nod, their power a palpable aura that filled the space around them. They spoke in low, measured tones, their conversations punctuated by long, calculated silences. They never hurried, never showed emotion, their control absolute. The deference they received from everyone, from the waitstaff to their own associates, was a stark lesson in the architecture of power. She felt like a different species entirely, a small, fragile creature navigating a forest of ancient, unmovable predators, acutely aware of her own insignificance in their world. The pressure had been building for weeks, a slow, steady tightening in her chest. It was the accumulation of 1,000 tiny cuts, a patron snapping his fingers at her, Mr. Henderson's veiled threat about being easily replaced, a letter from the student loan office with bold, red lettering. One evening, her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped a tray of empty glasses, the sound of them rattling against the silver, echoing the frantic beat of her own heart. She retreated to a dark alcove for a moment, pressing her palms against the cold marble wall, forcing herself to breathe. She felt fragile, as if one more ounce of pressure, one more unkind word, would be enough to shatter her completely. That was the moment the heavy oak doors swung inward, admitting a blast of cold night air and a figure she recognized with a sickening jolt. Mark stood there, swaying slightly, his face flushed with alcohol and a familiar, possessive anger. His eyes, clouded with a toxic mix of wounded pride and entitlement, scanned the room before locking onto hers. The low hum of the club seemed to fade into a dull roar in her ears. He started towards her, his steps unsteady but determined, a storm about to break over the fragile peace she had fought so hard to maintain. The invisible walls of her composure began to crack, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that there was nowhere left to hide. He sat in the darkest corner of the room, a man sculpted from shadow and silence. His presence was not announced by volume or gesture, but by the respectful void that surrounded him. Men who commanded fortunes gave his booth a wide, deferential berth. He wore a suit the color of a moonless night, tailored with a precision that spoke of immense wealth and discipline. Before him sat a single glass of amber liquid, untouched, a testament to a control so absolute it bordered on inhuman. He was not a patron enjoying the club's ambiance. He was the center of its gravity, a quiet, unmoving predator, whose stillness was more menacing than any overt threat. His name was a whisper in the city's underbelly, a name that carried the weight of history, violence, and an unbending, ruthless code. His face was a mask of cold neutrality, the features sharp and defined, as if carved from granite. Yet it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were dark, intelligent, and missed nothing, sweeping over the opulent decay of the club with a detached, almost weary assessment. He observed the petty dramas, the whispered deals, and the false laughter not as a participant, but as a sovereign observing the predictable machinations of a lesser species. There was a profound loneliness in his isolation, the kind that comes from standing so far above the world that no one can ever reach you. His power was not in what he did, but in what he could do. A potential energy that charged the very air he breathed with a palpable electric tension. As Clara's world fractured under Mark's assault, her desperate gaze locked onto this island of calm. An instinct she couldn't name, a primal pull toward the greatest power in the room, propelled her forward. She moved as if in a dream, the sounds of the club receding into a dull roar, her vision tunneling until only the man in the corner remained. Each step was a lifetime, a journey from her world of quiet dignity into an abyss she could not comprehend. Her feet carried her across the plush carpet, past frozen stairs, until she stood before his table, a trembling supplicant at an ancient silent altar. She was a moth drawn not to a flame, but to the perfect, consuming darkness that lay just beyond it. Her voice, when it came, was a thread of sound, nearly lost in the sudden heavy silence that had fallen around his table. "Please," she whispered, the word torn from the very core of her being, raw with a desperation that stripped away all pretense. Act like you're with me. Just for a moment. She did not look at him directly, her eyes fixed on the polished surface of the table, her own terrified reflection staring back at her. It was a plea born of pure instinct, a gamble made with the last of her courage. She had thrown herself at the mercy of a complete stranger, a man whose silence was more intimidating than Mark's loudest threats, hoping for a flicker of humanity in the encroaching void. He did not move for a long moment. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight that pressed down on Clara, threatening to crush her. Then, slowly, with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing, he lifted his head. His eyes met hers, and the world stopped. It was not a gaze of surprise or irritation. It was ancient, assessing, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was like looking into the heart of a winter night. He saw not just a frightened hostess, but the entire architecture of her fear, the lines of her quiet suffering, the unyielding steel of her moral spine. In that single, protracted moment, he seemed to read every chapter of her life, every small victory, and every crushing defeat, weighing her soul in the palm of his hand. Without breaking his gaze from hers, he shifted his focus slightly, looking over her shoulder toward the belligerent form of her ex-boyfriend. He said nothing. He did not frown, nor did his expression harden. He simply looked. And in that look was a finality, a chilling, absolute authority that transcended mere intimidation. It was a look that spoke of ended bloodlines and forgotten graves. Mark froze mid-sentence, the drunken bravado draining from his face as if a plug had been pulled. A primal, instinctual fear took its place, a recognition of a predator so far up the food chain that he was no longer even prey, but simply an obstacle to be removed. He paled, stammered a broken apology to the air, and practically fled from the room. The tension in the room snapped, and the low murmur of conversation hesitantly resumed, but for Clara, the silence remained. She stood trembling, a storm of relief and a new, more profound fear warring within her. The immediate threat was gone, but she had the terrifying sense of having invoked something far more dangerous. She had knocked on the door of a world she was never meant to see, and now its master was looking at her, his gaze holding her pinned in place. She opened her mouth to apologize, to thank him, to say anything that might sever this terrifying connection. But the words wouldn't form. She was trapped in the orbit of his stillness, unable to move, unable to breathe. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand, a slight flick of his fingers toward the empty chair across from him. It was not an invitation. It was a command, delivered with the casual certainty of a man who had never been disobeyed. Her body moved before her mind could protest, her legs feeling heavy and disconnected as she sank into the supple leather of the chair. The world of the Salinas room, her world of polite servitude, had vanished. She was now a guest at this table, an audience of one before a man who held the city's secrets in the palm of his hand. The polished mahogany between them felt like a chasm, a border between innocence and a knowledge so dark it could extinguish her light forever. He studied her then, his gaze intense and unwavering. It was not the leering look of other men in this club. It was something deeper, more unnerving. He was dissecting her, searching for the quality he had glimpsed, the desperate courage that had led her to him. Under his scrutiny, she felt utterly transparent, as if he could see the worn-out photo of her father, hear the resonant notes of her cello, and feel the weight of the loneliness she carried like a second skin. She noticed a faint, silver scar that traced the edge of his left temple, a whisper of a violent past that seemed at odds with his perfect composure. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not pity, but a flicker of recognition, a ghost of a shared wound. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, a quiet rumble that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. It was calm, measured, and carried a weight of absolute finality. He will not bother you again. It was not a promise or a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, a closing of a ledger she hadn't known was open. With that, he rose from his chair, his movements fluid and silent. He placed a few bills on the table, more than enough to cover a drink he never touched, and walked away without a backward glance. He disappeared into the shadows as seamlessly as he had emerged from them, leaving Clara alone at the table, the chill of his presence still clinging to the air, his final words echoing in the sudden, deafening silence of her new reality. The days following the incident were a study in forced normalcy. Clara moved through her routines, the disciplined scales on her cello, the scent of rosin in the air, the mechanical politeness of her job, with a desperate focus. She tried to convince herself it was a singular, bizarre event, a ripple in the water that had already smoothed over. Yet, the memory of his eyes, dark and assessing, was a permanent imprint on her mind. She felt a strange, unsettling debt to a man whose name she didn't even know, a phantom who had stepped out of the shadows to rearrange her world and then vanished just as quickly. His silence lingered more profoundly than Mark's shouting ever had, a quiet, powerful echo in the chambers of her thoughts. Then, she saw him. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the sky a pale, indifferent gray. As she left the conservatory, her cello case a familiar weight on her back. A long black sedan was parked across the street, its engine a low, barely audible hum. He was in the back, a silhouette against the tinted glass, looking directly at her. There was no gesture, no acknowledgement, just a steady, unnerving observation. He was watching her in her world, in the one place she felt whole and safe. The car was a piece of his shadowy kingdom brought into her daylight, a silent predator that had tracked her to her sanctuary. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She quickly turned away, her steps accelerating as she hurried toward the subway, refusing to look back. She told herself it was a coincidence, that a man like that had business all over the city. But she could not shake the feeling of his gaze on her back, a tangible pressure that followed her down the crowded street. It was a violation, a quiet assertion of power that told her she was no longer anonymous. He had not only saved her, but had also claimed a piece of her solitude. The city, which had once felt vast and liberating, now seemed to shrink around her, its corners and shadows all potentially holding the quiet weight of his presence, making her feel utterly and completely exposed. The next sighting was less ambiguous. 2 days later, in a small, unassuming coffee shop near her apartment, where she often went to study, he was there. He sat at a small table by the window, a newspaper held open in front of him, though his eyes were not on the print. They were on her as she walked in. The casual setting was a jarring contradiction to the man himself. He looked out of place in his impeccably tailored suit, a hawk in a sparrow's nest. A cold nod of fear and something else, a strange electric curiosity, tightened in her stomach. This was no accident. He was learning her habits, her routines, the small, insignificant map of her life. He was waiting. Their eyes met across the small, steam-filled room. The clatter of ceramic and the low murmur of conversation seemed to fade into a distant hum. His gaze was not threatening, not in the way Mark's had been. It was something far more complex and unsettling. It was possessive. It held a quiet intensity that stripped away her defenses, making her feel as though he could see the frantic beating of her heart from across the room. She stood frozen by the door for a long moment, trapped in that silent, charged current. Then, with a will she had to summon from her very core, she turned and left the shop, the untouched coffee and the warmth of the room forgotten behind her. A subtle but profound shift occurred at the Solenis room. Mr. Henderson, whose predatory oversight had been a constant source of anxiety, now treated her with a new, cautious deference. His leering smiles were replaced by clipped, respectful nods. He assigned her to the quieter sections of the club, away from the more aggressive patrons. She understood immediately. The man from the corner booth had cast a long, invisible shadow over her, a protective canopy she had never asked for. His influence had permeated the walls of her gilded cage, altering the dynamics of her oppression without a single word being spoken. The realization was terrifying. She was being protected by a power she could not comprehend and did not control. He began to appear at the club regularly, always at the same secluded table, always alone. His presence became a silent, gravitational force, around which the entire room seemed to orbit. The staff moved with a hushed efficiency near his booth, their fear and respect a palpable energy. Clara, by Henderson's unspoken decree, was the only one assigned to his table. Each time she approached, her hands trembled slightly. She focused on the minutiae of her tasks, pouring the water, placing the napkin, using the familiar rituals as an anchor in a sea of unspoken tension. She could feel his eyes on her every movement, a silent appraisal that made her skin prickle with a mixture of dread and a strange, unfamiliar awareness of her own being. One evening, as she poured his water, her unsteady hand caused a single drop to spill onto the polished mahogany. Before she could apologize, his hand covered hers, stilling the motion. His touch was not forceful, but it was absolute. A jolt, hot and sharp, shot up her arm. His skin was cool, his grip firm and steadying, a stark contrast to her own trembling. The contact lasted only a second, an eternity, before he withdrew his hand as if nothing had happened. But the ghost of his touch remained, a brand of heat on her skin. It was the first physical contact between them, an accidental breach of the silent contract that governed their interactions, and it left her breathless. He broke the silence that night, his voice the same low, resonant timbre that she remembered. "The cello," he said, his gaze fixed on her face, not the menu. "It requires discipline. A steady hand." The words were simple, but their implication was immense. He had not just seen her outside the conservatory, he had been paying attention. He saw beyond the black dress and the polite, empty smile. He saw the musician, the artist, the woman she fought so hard to be. The personal nature of the comment disarmed her completely, cracking the professional facade she wore like armor. For the first time, she felt seen by a patron not as an object or a servant, but as a person. This glimpse of the man behind the myth was profoundly destabilizing. Her fear of him was a simple, understandable thing. This new feeling, this fascination with the mind behind those observant eyes, was far more dangerous. She saw a flicker of something in his expression then, a deep-seated weariness that seemed at odds with his immense power. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, who understood the mechanics of the world so completely that it no longer held any surprises, only disappointments. In that brief, unguarded moment, she didn't see a monster. She saw a profoundly lonely king, isolated on a throne built of secrets and silence, and a treacherous seed of empathy began to take root in her heart. She found herself thinking about him at odd hours, the memory of his steadying touch, or his quiet observation intruding upon her cello practice. The notes of a somber Bach suite would suddenly evoke the deep melancholy she sensed in him. She fought against it, reminding herself of the world he represented, a world of violence, corruption, and moral decay, everything her father had taught her to despise. Yet the sense of safety she felt under his invisible protection was undeniable. It was a corrupting comfort, a devil's bargain she had made without even realizing it. She was caught between her rigid moral compass and the undeniable pull of a man who offered a sanctuary as perilous as the dangers he kept at bay. He, in turn, watched her with an intensity that unsettled his own ironclad control. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by people who wanted something from him: power, money, protection. They were all transactional, their loyalty as shallow as their greed. But this woman, with her quiet dignity and her fierce attachment to a world of art and beauty, wanted nothing. She had come to him out of pure, desperate survival. Her innocence was not naivete, it was a form of strength he hadn't encountered before. It was a light that, to his astonishment, did not recoil from his darkness, but instead seemed to illuminate the long-forgotten corners of his own soul, stirring a protective instinct he thought had died long ago. The next time he was at the club, he left something for her, besides the usual generous tip. Tucked neatly under the edge of his glass was a single pristine sheet of manuscript paper. It was blank, a clean slate of infinite possibility. There was no note, no explanation. The gesture was both intimate and unnervingly perceptive. It was not a gift of money, which she would have rejected, but an acknowledgement of her deepest identity. It was a silent message that said, "I see you. I know what you are." The stark white paper on the dark wood of the table felt like a symbol of their two worlds colliding, her art and his darkness, her potential and his silent, all-encompassing control. Clara clutched the single sheet of paper on her bus ride home, its crisp edges a stark contrast to the worn fabric of her coat. The gift was a profound and terrifying intimacy. He was no longer just an observer. He was actively engaging with her, reaching across the chasm that separated their lives with a gesture she could not easily categorize. It felt like a test, a question she didn't know how to answer. Was it an encouragement or a warning? A recognition of her dreams, or a subtle reminder that he knew everything about her, even the things she held most sacred? The blank page felt heavy with unspoken meaning, a silent challenge that left her feeling more vulnerable than ever before. The city's chill seemed to bite deeper that night as she walked the final block from the bus stop to her apartment. The street was poorly lit, the familiar storefronts shuttered and dark. A sense of being watched, more acute than ever, prickled at the back of her neck. Ahead of her, two figures detached themselves from the shadows of a recessed doorway, their movements slow and deliberate. They were large men, dressed in clothes that were too cheap to belong in the Silenus room, but too menacing for this quiet neighborhood. They didn't speak, but their intent was a palpable wave of aggression that washed over her, freezing the breath in her lungs. They blocked her path, their faces grim and unreadable in the dim light. Panic seized her, cold and absolute. This was not a random mugging. Their eyes held a specific, targeted malice. This was about him. This was the consequence of his shadow falling over her life. She took a step back, her hand tightening on the strap of her cello case, her mind racing for an escape route that didn't exist. One of the men took a step forward, a cruel smile beginning to form on his lips. "You're the musician," he rasped, the words confirming her worst fears. "He has expensive taste." Just as the man reached for her, the world was split apart by a sudden, blinding glare. A pair of powerful headlights cut through the darkness, pinning them all in a stark, unforgiving spotlight. A black sedan had glided to a silent stop at the end of the narrow street. The two men froze, their bravado instantly evaporating, replaced by a raw, primal fear. They exchanged a panicked glance, and then, without another word, turned and vanished into the enveloping darkness from which they had emerged. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the low, predatory hum of the car's engine. The rear passenger door swung open with a soft, expensive click, revealing a deep, shadowed interior. He was inside, a silhouette against the dim city glow, his face unreadable. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply waited, the open door a silent, absolute command, an invitation into his world, and the only escape from the dangers it had brought to hers. Her feet remained rooted to the cracked pavement, a silent, stubborn rebellion against the inevitable. The open door of the sedan was a black, rectangular void, a portal to a world she had only glimpsed from the periphery. Getting into that car felt like a final, irrevocable surrender, an admission that her small, carefully guarded life was no longer her own. The low, resonant hum of the engine was a siren song of safety and damnation, promising escape from the immediate terror of the streets, while pulling her deeper into the orbit of a far greater danger. She could feel his gaze from the shadows within, a patient, unwavering pressure. It was not a question of if she would get in, but when. With a shuddering breath that felt like the snapping of a final thread to her old self, she moved forward. The world outside vanished the moment the heavy door closed with a soft, definitive thud. The city's chaotic symphony was replaced by an absolute, insulated silence, broken only by the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. The interior smelled of rich leather and something else, a clean, cold scent like winter air. She pressed herself against the far door, the vast space between them feeling both immense and suffocatingly small. He had not moved. He was a statue of perfect, menacing stillness, his presence consuming all the oxygen in the small, luxurious space. This was his territory, a mobile extension of his shadowy kingdom, and by entering it, she had willingly placed herself under his jurisdiction. She was no longer a hostess, no longer a student. She was merely an object under his protection. He did not look at her. His attention was fixed on the street, his eyes scanning the darkness with a predator's focus, ensuring the threat had truly receded. For a long moment, he was not the enigmatic figure from the club, but a tactician assessing a battlefield. She saw it then, the subtle, rigid tension in his shoulders, the hard line of his jaw beneath the mask of calm. He was not untouchable. His decision to intervene, to reveal his interest in her so publicly, had come at a cost. He had exposed a flank, created a vulnerability, and the cold, controlled anger radiating from him was not directed at her, but at himself for allowing it to happen. He had broken a rule, a cardinal law of his own making, and the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. The car pulled away from the curb with a fluid, silent grace, gliding through the sleeping city like a phantom. The streetlights painted fleeting stripes of gold across his impassive face, illuminating the sharp angles and the deep shadows. Clara watched her neighborhood slip by through the tinted window, the familiar, gritty landscape looking alien and distant, a place she no longer belonged. The silence in the car stretched, thick and heavy with everything unsaid. It was a silence born of immense power on his side and profound fear on hers. It was the silence of a chessboard after a pivotal move has been made. the air charged with the infinite, terrifying possibilities of what would come next. She felt an overwhelming urge to fill the void, but her throat was tight with a fear that stole her voice. Finally, as the car crossed a bridge, leaving her part of the city behind for the cold, glittering spires of downtown, he turned his head and looked at her. His gaze was not cold this time. It was heavy, weighted with a grim understanding that seemed to age him in an instant. He saw the terror in her eyes, the trembling of her hands clasped in her lap, and he saw the unyielding core of courage that kept her from looking away. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes, a ghost of regret, a trace of empathy, or perhaps just the weary recognition of a complication he had brought upon himself. He was seeing the human cost of his protection, the collateral damage to a life that had, until him, been defined by its quiet integrity and fragile peace. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, quiet rumble that seemed to absorb the last of the silence. They were not random, they were a message. Sent to me, through you. The admission was a quiet detonation in the confines of the car. It was not an apology, but a statement of fact, a confirmation of the terrible truth she had already guessed. He was confessing that his world, with its brutal and unforgiving rules, had bled into hers. This was the ultimate transgression of his code. Not just feeling an attachment to an outsider, but allowing that attachment to become a weakness his enemies could see and exploit. He had made her a target, and in doing so, had irrevocably bound her fate to his own. The cold dread that washed over Clara was sharp and clarifying. It burned away the last of her passive fear, leaving behind a hard, defiant anger. This was her life he had gambled with, her safety he had compromised. Her own moral transgression came in a single, whispered word. A question that was not a plea for information, but a demand for accountability. Why? It was a challenge, a refusal to remain a silent pawn in his dangerous game. She was no longer the frightened hostess begging for a moment's pretense. She was looking at the king, stained by his own choices, and demanding to know the reason for his sacrifice. The word hung in the air between them, a fragile but unbreakable thing, shifting the balance of power in a way he had never anticipated. He did not answer with words. The truth of his motive was too complex, too deeply buried beneath years of violence and isolation, to be articulated. Instead, he reached across the space that separated them. His movements were slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. He gently took her hand. His touch was not possessive, but grounding, a silent, profound confession. It was not a gesture of romance or desire, but of a shared, terrible solitude. In the firm, warm grip of his fingers, she felt the full, crushing weight of his loneliness, the unspoken admission that her simple, desperate courage had awakened a protective instinct in him that he thought had died long ago. It was an anchor, but it was also a manacle, binding them together in his darkness. The car slowed, gliding to a stop before a towering, anonymous luxury hotel whose entrance gleamed with discreet, old-world wealth. A doorman in a crisp uniform moved forward, his expression impassive, awaiting a signal. He released her hand, and the sudden absence of his touch left her skin feeling cold and exposed. "You will stay here tonight," he said, his voice once again devoid of emotion, a simple declaration of a new reality. "You will be safe." He had made the decision for her, stripping her of her agency in the name of her protection. The act was complete. He had shattered his own isolation to shield her, and she had stepped into his gilded cage to survive. The moral lines they had both lived by had been irrevocably blurred into a shared shade of gray. She sat frozen for a moment, the silence after his command stretching into an eternity. Her gaze shifted from the imposing marble facade of the hotel back to his face, which was once again an unreadable mask of shadow and control. There were no more words to be said. The transaction was done. She had sought refuge in the deepest shadow, and now that shadow had enveloped her completely. He had found a flicker of light in his world of darkness, and, in trying to protect it, had inadvertently begun to extinguish it. They both understood, in that final, heavy silence, that neither of them could ever go back to what they were before this night. Everything had changed, and the cost was yet to be counted. The suite was a silent, gilded prison floating 20 stories above the city. Clara stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, a ghost in a borrowed silk robe watching the relentless river of headlights flow below. The room was a landscape of impersonal luxury, cool marble, untouched champagne on ice, and a bed so large and white it felt like a snowfield. He had provided safety, but it was the safety of a museum piece placed carefully under glass, preserved but lifeless and isolated. The silence here was different from the solitude of her own small apartment. It was a dense, manufactured quiet, paid for and absolute, and in it, she could hear the frantic, useless beating of her own heart. The city she had known, a place of struggle and small triumphs, now looked like a distant, alien constellation. The next morning, a man she had never seen before, dressed in a suit as severe as his expression, delivered a key and an envelope. He spoke in a clipped, deferential monotone, his eyes never quite meeting hers. Inside the envelope was a substantial amount of cash and a lease for an apartment in a quiet, anonymous building on the Upper West Side. There was no note from him, no word of explanation. It was a clean, brutal transaction, a severing. He was not offering a connection. He was managing a liability. He was moving a chess piece to a safer square, not to protect the piece itself, but to preserve the integrity of his game. The cold efficiency of the gesture was more chilling than any threat. She was a secret to be kept, a problem to be solved and then forgotten. He retreated back into the shadows of his own world, the world that had produced the men on the street. The incident had sent ripples through the city's underworld, a subtle shift in the balance of power. His enemies, smelling a weakness they had never before detected, began to test the edges of his territory with renewed boldness. He met their challenges with a swift and silent brutality that reasserted his dominance, but the effort cost him. Each move he made was now shadowed by the memory of her face, of the moment he had sacrificed his impenetrable isolation for a woman whose only currency was her integrity. He sat alone in his dark, wood-paneled office, the city lights a cold fire below, fighting a war on two fronts, one in the streets, and a far more dangerous one inside himself. The new apartment was a sterile, beige box. It was clean, secure, and completely devoid of character. It felt like a witness protection safe house, a place designed for someone to disappear. Clara unpacked her few belongings, her sheet music, the framed photo of her father, her cello, but they seemed like foreign artifacts in this empty space. She tried to practice, but the notes that emerged from her instrument sounded thin and hollow, swallowed by the thick, soundproofed walls. The blank sheet of manuscript paper he had given her sat on her music stand, a constant, silent accusation. It was a symbol of a potential he had seen in her, a future that now felt impossible, tainted by the source of her newfound, suffocating safety. She was free from danger, but she had never felt more captive. The most profound change was the silence. The black sedan no longer appeared outside the conservatory. The corner booth at the Salinas Room, a place she could never return to, was empty in her mind's eye. The constant, low-grade hum of his surveillance, which had once felt like a threat, was now a palpable absence. She had railed against his cage, but she had not been prepared for the crushing weight of the void it left behind. The city, which she had once navigated with a cautious independence, now felt menacing in a different way. It was no longer his forest, where he was the apex predator. It was just a wilderness, and she was alone in it again, but this time with the knowledge of what kind of monsters truly lurked in the shadows. One afternoon, while washing a glass, she felt a ghost of a sensation on her hand, the memory of his fingers covering hers, firm and steadying. The jolt was so real, so visceral, that the glass slipped, shattering in the sink. The sound broke the apartment's oppressive quiet like a gunshot. It was not a romantic memory. It was the memory of a connection forged in terror and necessity, a brief, terrifying moment of shared humanity. He had reached across an impossible divide and touched not just her hand, but the very core of her being. In that single, fleeting contact, he had shown her his own damnation, and she had shown him a reason to care about it. The loss of that connection felt like a physical ache, a phantom limb she would carry forever. He sat through meetings where men spoke of violence and betrayal in calm, businesslike tones. He gave orders that would end lives and alter fortunes, his face a mask of cold, unwavering control. But his focus was a fractured thing. In the reflection of the polished boardroom table, he would see her standing by his booth, her eyes wide, with a fear that was eclipsed only by her courage. She was a note of pure, clear music in a symphony of dissonance and decay. The decision to push her away was a strategic necessity, the only way to remove the target from her back. Yet it felt like a self-inflicted wound, a surgical removal of the one thing that had made him feel something other than the crushing weight of his own power. He had chosen his kingdom over its only light. Clara stood by the window of her new apartment, watching rain streak down the glass, blurring the city into a watercolor of bleeding neon. The weeks of fear and confusion began to settle, solidifying into a hard, cold lucidity. She finally understood. He had not simply saved her. He had bought her. He had paid for her safety with his own code, and she had paid for it with her freedom. She was not an innocent victim in his story. She had walked to his table, she had gotten into his car, she had made a choice, and this sterile, silent room was the consequence. The pain of it was sharp, but it was a clean pain, the pain of a truth finally acknowledged. She had survived, but the girl who loved Bach and believed in the simple purity of art was gone. The ticking of the clock on the wall became the only rhythm in her life, each second a drop of water wearing away stone. The city outside her window moved on, a silent, indifferent spectacle. She came to realize that the most powerful thing that had passed between them was what they had never said. Their entire relationship was built in the spaces between words, in a shared glance, a silent command, a steadying touch. His final act, this silent, distant protection, was another form of that language. He was telling her, in the only way he knew how, that she was too good for his world. The silence he had imposed was not a punishment, but a final, desperate act of preservation, a last attempt to keep his darkness from consuming her light completely. One evening, she took her cello from its case. The familiar weight of the instrument in her arms was a comfort, a connection to the person she used to be. She sat not by the window, but in the center of the empty room, and drew her bow across the strings. It was not a piece she had practiced, not a melody written by a long-dead master. It was a new sound, hesitant at first, then growing in strength, a composition of sorrow, resilience, and a profound, aching loneliness. The music filled the silence, not erasing it, but giving it shape and meaning. It was her answer to his unspoken words, a final, solitary note played into the vast, echoing quiet that now defined both of their lives. 2 years later, Clara stood on a stage bathed in warm, amber light, the very same hue that once illuminated the gilded cage of the Salinas room. But this light was different. It was a spotlight of her own making, earned through relentless practice and an unyielding will to reclaim her life. The familiar, grounding weight of her cello rested against her, its dark wood gleaming. Before her, the expectant hush of a sold-out recital hall held its breath. The fear she felt was no longer the cold dread of survival, but the electric thrill of a creator, about to share a piece of her soul. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's world. She was the solid, breathing heart of her own, about to fill the silence with a story only she could tell. She drew her bow across the strings, and the first note emerged, deep, melancholic, and resonant with a history of sorrow. It was the piece she had composed in the sterile silence of her gilded prison, a melody born from fear and loneliness. The music swelled, telling a story of a quiet girl, of a terrifying shadow, and of the perilous sanctuary found within it. It spoke of shattered glass in a quiet apartment and the ghost of a touch that lingered for years. Each crescendo was a moment of defiance. Each quiet passage was a memory of the heavy, loaded silences she had shared with him. She closed her eyes, pouring every ounce of her survival, her pain, and her hard-won peace into the instrument, letting the music become her final, cathartic confession. As the final, haunting note hung in the air, vibrating with all the things left unsaid, a profound silence enveloped the hall. In that suspended moment between the end of the music and the beginning of the applause, Clara opened her eyes. Her gaze drifted instinctively toward the back of the theater, to the deepest shadows near the exit doors. And there he was. He stood alone, a silhouette against the dim light, just as he had been that first night. He was not the king of an underworld empire now, but simply a man in a dark overcoat, a solitary spectator who had paid for a ticket. Their eyes met across the vast, darkened space, and for a breathtaking instant, the two of them were the only people in the world. Time collapsed. In that single, protracted gaze, an entire novel of loss, protection, and sacrifice was exchanged. He saw not the frightened hostess but the triumphant artist, a woman who had taken the darkness he had thrust upon her and transformed it into a thing of terrible beauty. She saw not a monster or a savior, but a man forever bound to his own lonely throne, who had come to bear witness to the one good thing he had ever tried to preserve. There was no ownership in his eyes, no lingering threat, only a deep, quiet, and profoundly weary respect. It was a final, silent acknowledgement of their shared history, an absolution granted and received across an impossible distance, a quiet farewell that needed no words. Then the spell was shattered by a single person clapping, followed by a thunderous, rising wave of applause that crashed over her, a testament to the story her music had told. It was a roar of approval, of connection, of pure, unadulterated triumph. She blinked, momentarily blinded by the stage lights, reflecting off her own tears, and when she looked back to the shadows where he had stood, he was gone. He had vanished as seamlessly as he always did, a phantom who had come only to see that the light he had shielded was now bright enough to stand on its own. He did not need to hear the applause. His penance was in the witnessing, not the celebration. Clara stood, taking her bow as the applause washed over her, a single, warm tear, tracing a path through the makeup on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of a deep and complex peace. She was free, but she would forever be shaped by the echo of his darkness, just as he was forever changed by the memory of her light. Theirs was a story that would never be told, a silent, impossible bond forged in a moment of desperation, proving that redemption is not always a grand gesture, but sometimes just a quiet, unwavering choice to protect a single flicker of hope. If this story of light and shadow resonated with you, let us know by liking and sharing. Subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what you believe his final gesture truly meant.